Welcome to Sustainability Soundbites, a deeper dive. I'm your host, and I'm thrilled to have our lead risk analyst here with me today.
Hey there. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to getting into this one. It's a dense topic.
It really is. So to kick things off, right now there are Fortune 500 companies whose global sustainability reports look perfectly green, right?
Hmm.
But their credit ratings are quietly being downgraded just because a single river near one of their factories is running dry.
Yeah, which is wild to think about. I mean, we usually picture corporate sustainability as something, quite pleasant. Glossy brochures with photos of solar panels, maybe a CEO planting a tree.
Exactly. Or like a graph showing a slow, steady reduction in global carbon emissions. Feels abstract,
Yeah.
like this long-term feel-good PR project.
Right. And that was a reality for a long time. It was basically treated as a corporate communications exercise, just a nice to have metric that lived in a silo.
Totally detached from the actual operational survival of the business.
Exactly. But when you peel back the layers and look at the actual risk models being used by lenders and regulators right now, that glossy brochure goes right out the window.
Yeah, it really does. We are looking at a landscape that is hard, unforgiving, and deeply financial. And for today's session, we have an incredibly fascinating stack of intelligence digests and risk briefings from early 2026.
Yeah, primarily we're looking at the E&E Leader Volume 2 Water and Compliance Edition alongside their highly detailed week in risk briefing.
Right. And our mission today is to help you, the listener, understand this massive, completely under-the-radar paradigm shift that's happening right now. We're going to explore how environmental risks, specifically water, are rapidly completing their journey from fuzzy, feel-good sustainability metrics into hard, unforgiving financial liabilities.
It's a sobering stack of reading, honestly. What these documents reveal is, well, a fundamental rewiring of how global markets assess value and vulnerability.
Exactly. So whether you are prepping for a boardroom meeting, analyzing supply chains, or you're just insanely curious about how global systems actually work, this deep dive is going to give you the ultimate shortcut to understanding the risk landscape of 2026. Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah, let's dive in.
So before we can even touch on the new regulations or the infrastructure vulnerabilities, we really have to follow the money because the capital markets are completely repricing environmental exposure as we speak.
They are. And they're doing it quietly, but with ruthless efficiency. If you dig into the Intelligence Digest from March 2026, it is abundantly clear that the era of investors being satisfied with just a general corporate policy on, like, responsible water use, that's completely dead.
Dead and buried.
Right. In the current 2026 shareholder engagements, major ratings agencies, we're talking MSCI, Sustainalytics, S&P Global, they've materially increased the weighting of physical water risks.
Meaning they don't want the global summaries anymore.
Exactly. They are demanding facility-level data. They want every significant operational site cross-referenced with biological watershed geographies.
Using specific mechanisms like the World Resources Institute's Aqueduct tool, right?
Yeah, exactly that tool. And this is exactly where companies are hitting a massive wall.
Right. The sources call it an architecture mismatch. Historically, ESG reporting was built to aggregate data upward. So a massive multinational would pull all its utility bills together to say, hey, globally, we use 10% less water this year.
Right, look at our great global average.
But investors do not care about the global average anymore.
Yep.
They want companies to disaggregate downward. They want stress tests against 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius trajectories at the exact local level of a specific facility.
Yeah, which is incredibly difficult to do.
It's like trying to figure out if your house is on fire by looking at the average temperature of your entire state.
That's a great way to put it. And what's fascinating here is that global aggregates actively mask local stress. Think about the mechanics of a multinational beverage corporation or a semiconductor manufacturer.
Right, water-heavy industries?
Exactly. They might look fantastic on paper globally because they've optimized their total water usage across 50 plants. But if you disaggregate that data and look at the local level, you might find they have massive unquantified exposure in a highly water-stressed subregion.
Like the American Southwest or parts of northern Mexico.
Right. And if that one local watershed dries up, that specific facility goes offline. The global average means absolutely nothing when the pipes at your most profitable factory run dry.
And the lenders have absolutely caught onto this blind spot, which ties directly into the refinancing risk highlighted in these briefings.
Yeah, the debt cycle.
Right? There's over $1 trillion in U.S. corporate debt maturing right now. in the 2025-2026 cycle. This is debt that was issued back in the ultra-low interest rate days of 2020 and 2021.
And the Intelligence Digest notes that lenders, including institutional giants like BlackRock, are quietly integrating this localized climate exposure right into their core credit underwriting.
Which changes the entire cost of capital. A company's sustainability rating trajectory is no longer just a separate score sitting in an annual report.
No, it operates as a forward-looking credit signal. It directly influences borrowing costs and covenant structures.
Give me an example of how that works in practice.
Well, let's say a credit analyst sees a gap in your Scope 3 emissions data, meaning, the emissions in your supply chain that you don't directly control, or they notice a lack of watershed-level facility mapping.
They don't just view that as a simple administrative delay anymore.
Exactly. To a modern underwriter, that is a glaring management blind spot, and they price the debt accordingly. You are literally paying a financial penalty for the local risks you cannot mathematically disprove.
Wow. So even if a company spends millions to perfectly map their watershed data to appease the banks, they're still running headfirst into our next major theme. Because this need for hyperlocal facility-level data is no longer just an investor whim.
No, it's a strict legal mandate now, and the clock is ticking down incredibly fast.
Right, we are looking at the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive out of Europe. Specifically, the ESRS E3 water standard, which has massive operational implications for global companies regardless of where they are headquartered.
Yeah, the ESRS E3 standard demands extreme watershed-level data precision. It forces companies to legally disclose how their specific local operations impact the biological water basin they draw from.
And for what the directive calls Wave 2 companies, which are basically large, non-listed enterprises that have to begin reporting in 2026, the window to collect this data is slamming shut right now.
It is. The briefing makes a point of emphasizing that it takes a minimum of 6 to 9 months to properly collect this data.
Wait, if these are massive Fortune 500 companies with endless resources, why can't they just, buy a new software patch or plug in an API to fix this reporting issue? Why does it fundamentally take 9 months to pull water data?
Well, that goes right back to the architecture mismatch we discussed earlier. Standard enterprise software, the massive ERP systems companies use to run their businesses, was designed to track water at the corporate utility billing level.
So it tracks dollars and total gallons.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It was never built to map a biological hydrological basin. You cannot just install a software patch to fix physical reality.
So what do they actually have to do?
To get the data ESRS E3 requires, you need engineers physically installing submeters at local discharge points across hundreds of factories, and then cross-referencing that physical output with complex hydrological maps. That takes time, capital, and localized expertise.
So what does this all mean? What actually happens to a company that is technically in scope, desperately wants to comply with the regulators, but simply runs out of time because their ERP software is essentially speaking the wrong language?
It means they fail the audit, which jeopardizes their market access entirely. And the failure here isn't a lack of corporate intent. It is a fundamental failure of capability.
It's an operational failure.
Yeah. If we look at the Weekend in Risk briefing, it highlights a terrifying misalignment within corporate structures today. You have the energy team, the compliance team, and the procurement team all living in entirely different risk universes.
Which is a disaster waiting to happen.
Corporate compliance models assume that regulatory frameworks progress linearly, meaning deadlines might shift, but you can generally see them coming and plan accordingly. But the transition to ESRS E3 is not linear. It is a total architectural reset of how a company views its own physical operations.
And what's wild is that it's not even just the government regulators demanding this precision, it is the corporate buyers. The sources show that water stewardship is transitioning from a voluntary pledge to a hard contractual requirement.
Oh, absolutely. Major global brands in food, apparel, electronics, they're embedding water risk criteria right into their supplier qualification frameworks.
Using mechanisms like the Alliance for Water Stewardship, Standard version 3.0, which was adopted late last year.
Which fundamentally shifts the burden. To mechanically comply with AWS 3.0, a supplier actually has to prove that their local facility's water withdrawal rate does not exceed the natural recharge rate of that specific local watershed.
Wow, so if you are a textile manufacturer in a water-stressed region, you have to prove your factory isn't draining the local aquifer faster than the rain can refill it.
Exactly. The corporate buyers with the most purchasing power have realized that if their supplier's local river runs dry, their own global supply chain breaks. So they are legally pushing that massive reporting burden down the chain.
And if you can't prove your local watershed is secure, you simply do not get the contract.
Yep. It's that simple.
That commercial hardening is brutal. But let's say a company manages to fix its data architecture. They spend the 9 months, they map every watershed perfectly, they satisfy the buyers and the lenders. Even then, the actual physical water they discharge out of their pipes is under unprecedented regulatory scrutiny.
Oh yeah, we are officially entering the PFAS era.
Per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, the forever chemicals. This is undoubtedly the next massive compliance wildcard.
The scale of the enforcement here is staggering. The Safe Drinking Water Act has strictly limited PFOA and PFOS chemicals to just 4 parts per trillion.
And to put that scale into perspective for you, 1 part per trillion is roughly equivalent to a single drop of water diluted across 20 Olympic-sized swimming pools.
It's almost unimaginable.
It is an infinitesimally small amount, and yet facilities are now legally responsible for it. On top of that, CERCLA, the Superfund law that essentially forces companies to pay for massive historical environmental cleanups, has formally designated PFAS as hazardous substances,
which wildly expands a company's retroactive cleanup liabilities. Under CERCLA, liability is often joint and several.
Meaning what, exactly?
This means if your facility legally disposed of waste in a landfill 20 years ago, and that landfill is now found to be leaking PFAS, you could potentially be on the hook for the entire cost of the cleanup, even if your contribution was minimal.
Ouch. That is terrifying.
It creates a terrifying dynamic for environmental health and safety teams. It's basically geographic roulette.
Yes, the geographic roulette aspect is fascinating. Because of this chaotic patchwork of state-level actions, 2 identical manufacturing facilities can face completely different legal and financial risks based purely on where they happen to be located on a map.
Right. The state borders dictate everything.
The sources highlight Maryland and Wisconsin as prime examples of this disparity. Maryland is advancing a bill, SB 719-10-LN, that will completely ban sewage sludge containing 50 parts per billion of PFAS from being used in agriculture by late 2027.
And they are doing this because municipal utilities have almost no control over the industrial runoff coming into their systems.
Exactly.
That Maryland bill is a perfect example of cascading liability. The state bans the sludge, which means the utility has to find a new, vastly more expensive way to dispose of it, which means they're going to trace the PFAS back to the industrial facilities discharging into their system and aggressively push those costs upstream.
Right. And then you look at Wisconsin, which just released $125 million in stalled PFAS cleanup funding. But the digest notes a terrifying caveat. A single county's cleanup in Wisconsin, Marinette County, already exceeds $400 million.
One county.
Yeah. That $400 million figure in Marinette County is the perfect example of this geographic roulette. If that exact same facility had been built one state over, their financial liability could look completely different.
It is a massive balance sheet unknown, but it goes deeper than that because the regulatory mindset around enforcing all of this has shifted aggressively.
Yeah, talk to me about the shifting mindset.
Well, we have to look at the post-Sackett versus EPA landscape. That Supreme Court decision narrowed federal jurisdiction over wetlands, effectively removing federal protections from waters that lack continuous surface connections.
Which on the surface sounds like a deregulation that would make things much easier and cheaper for companies, right?
You'd think so, yeah. But the data actually shows it created a massive compliance mapping nightmare.
Because there's no federal standard anymore.
Right. Because there is no longer a blanket federal standard, multi-site corporate teams now have to hire hydrologists to do a site-by-site assessment of every drainage ditch on their property just to figure out if their facility falls under federal jurisdiction, state jurisdiction, or no jurisdiction at all.
Which completely destroys regulatory uniformity.
Exactly. But even more critically, it has changed how regulators are behaving during routine inspections.
Right, the Q1 enforcement signals from the digest. Regulators are treating paperwork errors completely differently now. Let's look at a SWPPP, a Stormwater Pollution Prevention Plan. If a facility manager has a typo on their SWPP or doesn't perfectly match the physical conditions on the site, regulators are no longer treating that as a simple administrative oversight.
No, they're treating it as hard evidence of a systemic compliance management failure.
And the same exact logic is being applied to discharge monitoring reports, or DMRs. Inaccuracies on a DMR are increasingly being treated by inspectors as independent, standalone violations of the Clean Water Act. Wait, so you're telling me that a mismatched document on a clipboard is being treated as a more serious liability than an actual spill?
Mechanically, in the eyes of a regulator, yes.
That's crazy.
I know, but think about it from the perspective of an inspector walking onto a site. A single spill is an accident, It's an isolated operational failure. But an inaccurate pollution prevention plan, or a DMR that hasn't been updated to reflect the new jurisdictional maps post-Sackett, implies that absolutely no one is managing the environmental program at a structural level.
It points to an ongoing systemic violation.
Exactly. The regulatory perimeter is expanding, and agencies are using data quality and reporting accuracy as their primary weapons. If your paperwork is wrong, they don't assume it's a typo. They assume your entire facility is a hazard.
That is a chilling thought. For any facility manager who thinks they are safe just because their actual water discharge is clean. But we have to zoom out even further now. We've talked about the financial modeling, the reporting architectures, the complex regulatory net closing in.
Right, the paperwork side of things.
But none of that spreadsheet math or perfect paperwork matters if the physical pipe delivering the water simply runs dry. What happens when the actual infrastructure delivering the water fails, or worse, comes under direct attack?
This is the physical reality that breaks all the financial models. You can perfectly map your data and appease your lenders, but you cannot negotiate with a dry aquifer or a bombed pipeline.
Here's where it gets really interesting.
Yeah.
Corporate water risk assessments can no longer just look at drought forecasts. They must explicitly model armed conflict scenarios targeting critical water infrastructure.
Yeah, the geopolitical threat is very real now.
The Intelligence Digest covers the ongoing Gulf conflict, specifically noting recent targeted strikes on desalination plants in Bahrain and Iran. This exposes a terrifying geopolitical vulnerability, considering the Gulf region gets roughly 90% of its potable water from desalination.
The distinction between an energy shock and a water shock is vital to understand here. The same briefing covers a massive Iranian drone strike on a Qatar LNG facility that took 20% of global liquefied natural gas exports offline.
Which is a massive crisis causing tens of billions in damage.
Right, but mechanically, energy can theoretically be rerouted. If you lose natural gas, you can ship in LNG carriers from other regions, you can burn coal, you can rely on reserves, but potable water from desalination.
It's completely different.
Yeah, water is incredibly heavy and highly localized. You cannot ship water at the scale a population or a massive semiconductor fab requires. If the desalination plant goes down, there is no short-term substitute. The water simply stops. Water is officially a war target.
And while that geopolitical targeting in the Gulf is an extreme scenario, the domestic water infrastructure vulnerabilities right here in the U.S. are just as concerning, simply due to age and competing biological interests.
Definitely.
The Digest points out that Los Angeles just marked the 100th anniversary of the Mulholland Dam. It is a vital local supply buffer for millions of people, but it is a century old and is currently undergoing seismic safety evaluations.
And this evaluation is happening precisely as the region's external lifelines, like the Colorado River allocations and the Sierra Nevada snowpack, are actively declining.
It is the perfect metaphor for corporate America's hidden balance sheet risks. You are relying on a century-old piece of concrete to secure the operational continuity of a multi-billion-dollar business.
Yep. And then you have the Flathead River Plan up in Montana, where there is a bitter ongoing clash over water usage. You have threatened biological species, like the bull trout, that absolutely require cold, clean flows to survive.
And those ecological needs are clashing directly and forcefully with agricultural and recreational water uses.
It is a zero-sum game for a shrinking resource. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, it perfectly illustrates the profound argument made in the week in Risk Briefing regarding optionality versus optimization.
Break that down for us.
Well, for the last 10 to 15 years, corporate strategy was entirely focused on optimization. Minimizing slack, removing redundancy, tightening capital cycles.
The ultimate just-in-time supply chain model.
Precisely. To use an analogy, it's like a supply chain that fired all its warehouse managers to save money, assuming the delivery trucks will perfectly sync up with the assembly line every single minute of every day. But in 2026, precision is fragile.
Because the world isn't predictable anymore.
Right. That just-in-time model assumes stable constraints. And our constraints, the regulatory environment, the climate, the infrastructure, are no longer stable.
You see that same fragility in the electrical grid right now. The briefing notes that the lead times for large power transformers are currently running 2 to 4 years. 2 to 4 years just to get a replacement part. If a critical component fails, you cannot just procure your way out of the disruption.
And water infrastructure is the exact same way. It severely lacks redundancy. The competitive advantage today does not come from minimizing slack to save a few pennies on the margins. It comes from preventing forced decisions.
Right.
You have to build redundancy into your systems, like on-site water recycling or secondary supply contracts, even if it looks mathematically inefficient on a spreadsheet, because the ultimate cost of a complete operational failure is absolute.
It requires a total mindset shift from leadership. You are carrying massive hidden risk on your balance sheet if you assume your access to water and power will always be there simply because you signed a municipal contract 10 years ago.
Exactly.
By understanding these sources, you can really see the matrix now. Environmental risks are no longer abstract, long-term PR ideas. They are the exact, real-time metrics dictating a company's credit rating with BlackRock, a facility's legal survival against a SWPPP inspection, and the fundamental security of our global supply chains.
It is an entirely interconnected system. And to leave you with one final thought to mull over, we know that global power demands are absolutely exploding right now, driven largely by air conditioning needs and the massive build-out of AI data centers.
Oh yeah, it's staggering.
Washington state is already legally mandating that large data centers source 80% of their electricity from clean power by 2031. But those next-generation AI servers require massive amounts of physical water for cooling.
Wow, that's a collision course.
It really is.
Yeah.
As local water stress becomes an unignorable boardroom liability, how long until we see water-neutral mandates? How long until massive tech companies are legally forced to choose between deploying their next-generation AI models and completely draining the local municipal watershed?
If you have questions about being a part of future segments or other partnership opportunities, reach out to a member of our team today. Links are located in the body of this session's description.